Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today I am joined by an activist from Yemen who wants to remain anonymous for various reasons. So, therefore, this interview will be audio only. However, it's still very informative about the situation in Yemen and politics and geopolitics of the region. So, without further ado, here is the interview. So, first things first, what is your opinion on the role of Ansar Allah in both Yemeni politics and regional politics?
Yeah, so Ansarullah initially started, you can say even going back to the early 90s, maybe late 80s, uh, as a political party, right? And mostly in mosques, in Zaydi Shia mosques in Yemen. And their entire basis was rejecting Western influence in Yemen and largely also in the region. Obviously, Palestine was the first issue that kept in mind, but that followed with the U.S. invasion of Iraq and obviously U.S. backed war against Iran in the 80s by Iraq and stuff. Um, so Ansarullah has always had this foundation of rejecting Western influence within uh, the region and in Yemen. And so I view them as anti-colonial, which is good because I do think that is the main root issue in the region. And they finally acted upon it in the early 2000s, and they were crushed in the early 2000s, but they came back in 2014 after right after the Arab Spring. So I do view them in a more uh, positive light, let's say.
And still today, from a Western liberal perspective, there's a lot of criticism on groups like this one.
hmm
Um, how do you view the role they play in domestic politics in Yemen today, also in the context of the civil war?
Yeah, so at the moment, Yemen is carved up under many different ruling parties. Ansarullah controls what was previously North Yemen before the unification. Pretty much the same kind of territory, maybe minor differences. And the areas under Ansarullah's rule are economically better, more stable, and even more safe. They are able to be self-sufficient despite all the sanctions from neighboring countries and the global sanctions under the led by the U.S. So they are self-sufficient, and that is a good thing. They've been able to nationalize a lot of the farms and redistribute homes in North Yemen. There's a great article by Al Mayadeen, which is a Lebanese newspaper, and they really went deep into the agriculture reforms that Ansarullah undertook in Yemen. Uh, yeah, so
So they nationalized farmland. That's interesting because it makes them more leftist than many explicitly self-proclaimed leftist governments.
yeah, so that's the thing. Economically, they are more leftist, and of course, there are things that they could improve on, but they are more leftist than majority of the governments in the region itself.
And more recently, there's been these news reports of people from Yemen being enlisted to fight in Ukraine by Russia.
Yeah, I've heard about those, and whether or not they're true, I can't tell, obviously. But I do know that ever since the Ansarallah's operation in the Red Sea, they've been kind of growing some allyship with Russia, obviously through Iran as well, since they do have closer ties with Iran. So there are some. I've heard about that, but I honestly can't tell if that is uh, true or not.
So it's sort of in line with the North Koreans'
Yeah,
story, which I think is pretty much can be definitively considered not true by now because we're like
yeah,
6 weeks in and still not a single piece of evidence has emerged.
yeah.
Um, but just intuitively, do you find this story plausible?
I don't think so because I also recall a couple of months back there were reports of Yemeni fighters on the borders of Israel via the Golan Heights in Syria, and there was nothing true about that. There was no evidence. I mean, if that was the case, then they would definitely heard of it, and the Zionist entity would have made a big issue about it. I'm sure. So I do think these are not plausible reports.
Right. To me, it also doesn't make too much sense because I believe that the Ansarullah movement is also, in a sense, very much nationalist inspired.
Mhm.
And if that is the case, then militants in this movement would probably not be willing to fight for a different country in exchange for citizenship for that different country.
No, correct. So Ansarullah is purely focused on nationalism and also the Islamic nationalism as well. It does not like it is not ideologically aligned to fight non-Islamic or non-Arab struggle at all. So it does not align with the ideology of these fighters. Of course, Yemenis across the globe have been exploited because of the situation in Yemen across the globe, and it doesn't come as a surprise that they could be exploited. I know a lot of Yemenis were stuck in the Belarusian border, trying to enter Europe, and yeah, it is possible that they have been exploited, but these are not aligned or related to the Ansarullah movement. These are just Yemenis being exploited.
Right, right. So it would make sense for the Ansarullah government to actively engineer these kinds of deals between, for example, Russia and themselves.
I think obviously there is some ties growing between the two, but I don't think it makes sense or it doesn't align ideologically with actually sending fighters to fight in for Russia.
Can you briefly explain some details about the sectarian divides in Yemen, also in the context of the civil war, to give more of a general understanding of how the social fabric of this country.
So prior to the unification of the two nations, North and South Yemen, the South was pretty much all Sunni and other minority religions, and then the North was uh, majority Zaydi Shia, but still a large population of Sunnis as well. And so when they unified, it then just became a a Sunni majority country. um, However, the sectarian divide didn't really play much of a role in Yemen until the 80s when the Iran and Iraq war happened, the 8-year war. And some Zaydi Shias in Yemen started to feel some kind of sympathy towards Iran and the Iranian regime. Whereas because majority of the Arab countries supported Iraq in that war, as in to uphold like Arab nationalistic roots, which was uh, ironic because the Gulf countries were heavily opposed to Arab nationalism prior to that war, but suddenly they wanted it. Um, so then you started to see some Zaydi Shias kind of speak up a little bit. This was all under Saleh's regime, Ali Abdullah Saleh. Um, and then he started to see some, but it wasn't a large issue. It wasn't something consistently spoken about until, of course, the uh, the wars that happened like, the past 15 years. But up to that point, you had a lot of kind of Wahhabi ideology sweep in the Yemeni institutions
Did that come
via
from Saudi Arabia?
yes, majority from Saudi Arabia, and once that swooped in, they had a lot of people who were very anti-Shia in the country, and of course, when the Arab Spring happened and when the Houthi revolution happened, uh, immediately people placed them in a bucket as just Iranian puppets trying to seize control and just be a puppet for Iran and basically just play for Iran's interests. And so, especially after the Arab Spring, you start to see like a heavy sectarian divide. But it's also important to keep note that within Ansarullah fighters, there's a lot of Sunni Yemeni fighters as well, or Sunni people in government as well. So it's not this kind of purely one-sided thing, but there's a very big sectarian divide within Yemen, just like many other countries in the region.
Real briefly for the clarity for the audience, Ansarallah is the proper name for what's commonly known as the Houthi
Yes.
movement. And you talked about Ansarallah as a Zaydi Shia movement. Could you briefly elaborate on what distinguishes Zaydi Shiism from other forms of Shiism that are, for example, seen in Iran?
Yeah, it's not a whole, like, I can't give you much details because I'm not Zayd, but there's a lot of difference in the way they pray and the way some ceremonial things. It's all just minor details, and it's nothing like a massive difference, right? uh, and of course these movements and ideologies all changed over time and such, but I can't give you the exact details of what's different, but it's just a lot of minor things, but they still align themselves with Shia, at least in the current times.
You mentioned the allegations that they are quote unquote puppets of Iran, which I've heard a lot as well. What can you say about that? To what extent might there be some truth to that, and to what extent are they actually an autonomous political movement which happens to have an ally in Iran?
Yeah, so it's easy to just claim them as Iranian puppets just because they have the same, they're of the same sect, right? And anytime you see, especially in Western media, you see anything, any actions they take, immediately in the title you'll see Iranian-backed Houthi rebels, right? As a slap, as if Yemenis or Ansarullah themselves are unable to take any decisions without the approval of Iran, right? Um, there were some reports a few months into the after they started the operations in the Red Sea that even Iran is telling telling Ansarullah to kind of put some restraint in the operations, which Ansarullah refused and uh, kept their operations going. Whether or not these claims from Iran are true or not, we don't know. But we do know that every resources from Yemen that are from the Ansarullah areas stay within Yemen, and they all go back for the Yemeni people and the redistribution within the Yemeni people. There is no resources being taken to Iran from Yemen, besides just a close ally, and that's all they can say. Really, that's all they get from Yemen. They don't get any resources. They don't get any lands or unlike the south in Yemen, which is being exploited. And there is a great article by the news agency called The Cradle, where they go in depth about the energy sector in South Yemen and how it differs from North Yemen, how it's being exploited at the moment.
And the other way around, so there's not much going from Yemen to Iran, but is there much going from Iran to Yemen in terms of material support for Ansarallah specifically?
Yeah, so all the support that Iran provided for Yemen was always been first diplomatic, especially in the early days of Ansarullah as a political movement before the revolution. And then once the revolution started, there was some supply of weaponry and some financial supply to, and also industry to basically uh, have these weapons be built in Yemen instead of importing these weapons. So at this moment in time, it's mostly diplomatic support. There is nothing much else really. Of course, some supply of weapons here and there, but a lot of the weaponry that Ansarullah now uses, that you see now the past year, are all Yemen made. But they were with the help of the Iranian government during the peak years of the civil war.
And to avoid getting overly technical, recently we've seen Ansarallah use a hypersonic missile against Tel Aviv, which makes them one of 5 actors in the world to have this technology. So I believe right now the only countries that have this are Russia, Iran, China, North Korea, and now Ansarallah, which is, well, quite the interesting collection of countries. Do you think that they developed this indigenously, or might this have been with the help of Iran? And I know it's a very technical question.
Yeah, of course, This is all speculation. There's nothing confirmed. I'm not in the movement. I don't know, but it is all claimed to be Yemen made. Whether or not there was help from Italian, Asian, Iranian, Iranian agencies and intelligence, uh, that is possible. But the claim is that they are Yemeni made.
You mentioned something about Sunnis fighting within the Ansarallah movement, which is new to me. So, how does this come about? Because the ideology of the group is explicitly Shiite, right?
So that's not entirely true. The idea is the idea of Atallah is they don't have sectarian ideology in their foundation. Whether or not they favor shares in government and stuff, that is a different conversation. But the foundation, they reject kind of sectarian divide. Uh, and the Sunni fighters being under in the Yemeni armed forces is because at some point it was no longer just a clash between Yemenis. Of course, there was a foreign invasion. Of course, we know of the Saudi-led intervention. At that point, it became defending my homeland, right? And some people went that route, and some people chose to go the other route, which is to uh, support the intervention and fight against the Houthis. There was a lot of Sunnis who went that way as well, but also a lot of them who stuck with defending the homeland or just had no other choice but to defend their homeland, right? And so they ended up joining the Yemeni armed forces. And the armed forces is now huge, and it cannot consist of just the Sunni Shias, right? It's multiple backgrounds of people. Of course, it's led by the Zaidi Shias, but it's not only limited to them.
I believe at first in 2015, when Ansarallah took power in Yemen, they governed as part of what I believe they called a revolutionary governing council or something
Yeah,
along those.
Supreme Council. Yeah,
Right, right. Which consisted of actually a lot of different parties and sectarian and political groups,
yeah,
including, I believe, Arab nationalists, some
yeah,
people who were actually a relic of the old Marxist-Leninist South Yemeni People's Republic, if
yeah.
I'm not mistaken. To what extent is the government ruling the area led by Ansarullah still a coalition government?
At the moment, it's not much of a coalition because the country hasn't had the chance to kind of actually govern itself, and because it's been at war for the past. Well, in 2022, it was for 7 years, and then there was a ceasefire implemented, but the country is still it's a political crisis. There's obviously still sanctions, so it hasn't been able to govern itself. There is coalitions working together, but it is majorly ruled by the Ansar Allah party. And there is also another council that was made by the opposing side, the quote unquote official government of Yemen, that included the STC and other part. The STC is the Southern Transition Council, the ones who want to secede into South Yemen. Um, so yeah, they also have their own kind of council.
So is the role of the Supreme Revolutionary Committee now diminished, or is it are the other parties pushed out, or
It is kind of diminished at the moment. It doesn't. It's because it turned into the Supreme Political Council, which was formed by Ansar Allah, and at that point there was a lot of involvement with the previous president Ali Abdullah Saleh, because he kind of tried to play all sides and early in the during the civil war. So it is kind of it is still functioning as the Supreme Political Council. It's just heavily led by one party.
can you explain where the government that rules South Yemen is seated? Because I believe that is not actually within the territory of Yemen, right?
So yeah, so now we're getting, yeah. So there's multiple parties, right? And so you could say the north is under Ansarullah, right? And then the south is kind of it's free for all, right? It's so you have the like I said, the STC, the Southern Transition Council, that is based in the port city of Aden. Uh, they are based in Aden, but the official government that is still recognized by the UN and other parts of the world uh, is their main base is in Riyadh in Saudi. It's not in Yemen. Um, so indeed, yeah, the official government is not seated in Yemen at the moment, because you have the official government that rules parts of Yemen. Aden, which is the largest city outside of the north areas, is not also under the official government, although there is the coalition where they are trying to work together, but it's also going south, no pun intended, due to the different interests of their backers, which in this case are Saudi and UAE. Um, so yeah, the official government is not seated in Yemen at the moment. It's based in Riyadh.
Yeah, it's kind of strange that even in polite society, even in academia, Ansarullah is described as a non-state actor, and the guys sitting in a hotel in Riyadh are described as a
Yeah,
state actor.
that's kind of the irony of it all, right? And not also to take into account, like Ansarullah rule about 70% of the population, uh, and they're not the official government, which is pretty insane.
And to what extent do jihadist groups play a role? Because I believe Al Qaeda and or ISIS have some foothold as well in Yemen right now.
Yeah, so they do have parts, and they were kind of backed to cause a lot of issues with North Yemen, Ansarullah, and especially early in the civil war, there's like a the mosque bombings in 2015 that took place. It was like a Shia mosque that were being bombed and such by Al Qaeda and these groups. Um, they also were used to kind of target the Islah party, which is the Muslim Brotherhood party in Yemen. Now it's pretty much diminished. They do have a seat at the council, but they have no territory really under them, and they're kind of diminished. And this Al Qaeda and such were also backed by the UAE and such to fight these groups. So it's kind of a free for all, like I said, down there.
Yeah, so these Salafist jihadists were sort of used as the stormtroopers for the Saudi intervention.
Correct, correct. They were used that way, and they were also kind of uh, the justification to have these troops, these foreign troops, also on the ground, right, to deal with them as well as the Iranian-backed rebels in their view.
You mentioned the ceasefire, which was declared in 2023, early 2023. This happened in the context of the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, right?
Correct. So if you recall, China acted as the mediator, trying to mediate between Iran and Saudi. Obviously, there was the whole potential of BRICS and Iran and Saudi joining BRICS, and so China undertook this kind of mediator role between Iran and Saudi. And one of the main conversations was about, well, Yemen, because Iran and Saudi have been having their fight there basically. And yes, this came after that conversation, but it also came after Ansarullah hid deep within Saudi territory as well, their oil fields and such, and actually presented a threat to Saudi. And so it was also the smarter decision and strategic decision from Saudi to kind of like, okay, we're losing more than we're gaining at this point.
To what extent has the deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia effectively made a change for the situation on the ground in Yemen? Have people in Yemen noticed this deal in their daily lives in any way?
For sure, it's a lot more stable. Of course, the economy is still in crisis, and there's still a political crisis, but it is much more stable. You don't hear of constant airstrikes, not until the recent bombardment from the US and the UK, of course. There was basically a year and a half or 2 years almost of no airstrikes, right? There were, of course, some armed clashes between factions here and there, particularly in the south, like non-Ansarullah territories, and also some clashes within the Ma'rib area, which is where a lot of the oil is. And but it made the situation a lot more stable, and governments were able to build some kind of infrastructure, a lot with solar energy, for example. So for sure, it made it more stable. But the sanctions continue, and the sanctions are still a large part of this, and obviously it drove inflation up at an increasingly large rate. So it has shown, of course, and if it wasn't for the current escalation within the region, it would be also heading to a more more improvements basically, especially within North Yemen since it's not really contested for. So yeah, there has definitely been they definitely noticed it, but there's still a large economic and political crisis within the country.
The British and the Americans are, as you said, now somewhat regularly, also earlier this month, bombing Yemen again. Do you
Yeah,
think that this will be in some way effective in putting pressure on Ansarallah? Because, like, it might sound crude, but I believe, and the same goes for Israel, there's literally nothing short of nuking the country that they can do to Yemen, which it hasn't already endured for since 2015, right?
correct. So the UK and the US irregularly kind of bomb the country, whereas for 9 years prior to that, it was under constant bombardment from Saudi and their intervention, of course, made by U.S. bombs. So the country has already endured this stuff before, and this isn't something new. The question is, what happens when, let's say, there is a ceasefire in Palestine, and what is the next end goal for Ansarallah? Will they continue to leverage the situation in the Red Sea for themselves? If so, then we'll expect to see more of the US and the UK. Now, I don't expect them to continue their operations in the Red Sea if their conditions are met for Palestine and Lebanon, but we obviously saw the ceasefire coming for Lebanon a couple of days ago. In the current state, if it's just irregular bombing, I don't see any pressure coming into.
And how do you see the situation in Yemen? This is a tough or grand question, but how do you see it being resolved in the long term?
It was headed in the right direction with the ceasefire, and essentially Saudi was willing to negotiate with Ansar Allah, and they were both willing to negotiate, obviously, with the rebuilding of the country and kind of adding them into a coalition together with the other parties and kind of making a whole a coalition of multiple governments. However, these conversations kind of are on hold at the moment because of all the operations within the Red Sea and the basically the escalations within the region. But I would imagine the long term solution is to kind of first of all reject foreign interventions and also start the dialogues between all the different ruling parties. The problem is, for example, Saudi now is willing to negotiate and hand over the rule. But the problem is you have other actors, for example, the UAE, which is purely in there just to loot the resources. We also have UAE already control of the Socotra Island, in which a lot of the tourism is done, and a lot of the companies are UAE run. There's also Israeli military agency within that island as well for surveillance. So yeah, it's gonna be difficult because some parties are do not play for Yemen; they play for other parties, and that needs to be changed.
Do you think that the situation in Palestine could also play a role in bringing the different factions in Yemen closer together?
I would hope to say yes, but no, I don't think so. Unfortunately, a lot of parties and governments within the region are kind of even split on the Palestinian cause, even if they don't outwardly say it. There's a massive divide, and even their view of the Palestinian cause is very different from one another. With some are normalizers, two-staters, whereas others are very hardline, no recognition, no normalization. So no, I don't think so. Perhaps the people themselves, yes, but the parties and the governments definitely no.
From the looks of it, if you see like the million man marches in Sana'a and
Yeah,
these images coming out of Yemen, it looks like Ansarallah has a lot of popular support, which, well, you wouldn't be able to tell from watching Western media. To what extent is Ansarallah broadly supported among the population? And as a
yeah,
follow-up, to what extent does this support hinge upon their support for the Palestinian cause?
yeah. So a large population does support them purely after their operations for Palestine. Prior to the operations, they still had a massive support, particularly on the ground in Yemen. A lot of diaspora might not be very fond of them, of course, but they did have a lot of support with Yemen. But it did increase massively after the operations against the Zionist entity, and this doesn't only reflect the Yemeni population, but also the Arab population, where they also started to kind of back the support for Ansarullah. But yes, it did grow exponentially after the operations against the Zionist entity, but they also did have a large support before. It just, you could say, tripled.
Like you said, this support also extends to populations which are not directly controlled um, by Ansarullah, right?
Yeah.
So, might it be plausible that this support, which is present in the other territories, which is not shared by the governing powers there, but by the population, could be a factor in bringing these people closer together in a sort of future potential reconciliation of the country?
Yeah, for sure. It's like I said, it's no hopes for the parties, it's more hopes for the people, right? There is a possibility of the people being more willing. However, uh, that is being a bit optimistic, because, like we previously talked about, sectarian divide is large now in Yemen, and so despite their support of the Palestinian cause, some people will not be willing to shake hands with the other sect regardless, and that might still be an issue. But the Palestinian cause is kind of the only thing that the majority of the Arab population still agrees upon. Whether or not the actions they agree upon, that is definitely not the case. How to go about it is definitely debated and not agreed upon, and that is still and that is the main blocker for the populations to actually work together. But yes, it is kind of the last saving grace, because Arab nationalism is no longer kind of uh, regarded in a high manner. The only thing that kind of ties it all at the moment is the Palestinian cause.
The same might be said maybe for the Middle East in a broader sense, because of course, to take an example, well, I don't think there's many people in the Middle East who are very positive of the government in Jordan,
Yeah.
but the people of Jordan are very supportive of Palestine. I mean, like 25% of them are actually Palestinian. Do you think, in a broader sense, this conflict right now, the genocide going on, can bring the Middle East closer together in the future after this whole affair is over with?
Yeah, if we're talking purely logical, that would make sense. It was common sense, but at the same time, this has been going on for over 100 years. The Zionist influence and their terrorism in the region, and the Arabs have seen this for 100 years, and yet we haven't really come together. Of course, there were attempts, and of course, foreign intervention kind of crushed it all. But we also have a dialogue within ourselves that the Arabs are also not doing enough and are uh, not. Really going about it the right way. So yes, you like you said, you do see these things. For example, in Jordan and other Arab countries, you see all these protests. We see it in Morocco, we see it in Egypt, Tunis, and all these countries. But really, no, not enough action, right? And we've seen this go on for hundreds of years, or 100 years, I should say, the specific issue. And it's good to remain hopeful, but we can't really say for sure. Logically, it would make sense, seeing as the we have a word in Arabic. It's called the Aruba, which is the Arabness, basically, of these populations. But it seems to be dormant at the moment, at least when it comes to action.
Except for Yemen, of course.
Yes, it's a special case.
What explains this? The fact that of all the Arab peoples, it is Yemen who are actually arguably the most devastated and the most impoverished Arab peoples at this moment, that it is
Yeah.
exactly these people who uh, take up arms and take action to support Palestine rather than just voting for UN resolutions.
Yeah, the so Yemen's contemporary history, even actually long history, is very revolutionary in a sense. North Yemen became a country after 8 years of bloody war against the monarchy, which was backed by the other monarchies in the region and the UK. And the South was also a nationalist front and national liberation movement against the British. So the country at its roots is very revolutionary, and of course you can say that about many countries, especially within the region. but not all. Uh, and so, but a lot of these countries that were at some point revolutionary and turned very neoliberal uh, within the region, of course, had a lot of intervention come in and act upon this. And Yemen had this too. For 30 years under Saleh, Yemen did not do any revolutionary act. Were mainly Western puppets. Took in Western funding and such. The only time they stood against the West is during the Gulf War when they stood with Iraq, and that ended up costing Yemen a big time economically and such. But for 30 years, Yemen was not acting upon that. But then the Ansarullah revolution happened, and when you have a movement that is in its foundation anti-colonial, that is the end result you get. So at the end, it's just a matter of who takes the power, and if the one who takes power is anti-colonial, there will be acts. And the same is happening, for example, in Lebanon. There's a part of Lebanon that is anti-colonial and is under a specific rule, which is anti-colonial. And so they decide to take action. And the same with Iraq. So it's at the end of the day, it is the ruling parties and what is their foundation, their ideology, and that is what takes part. And Yemen, just having its roots in revolution and anti-colonial, they ended up taking action.
And do you think that the fact that in the very recent past, or you could say in the present, the people of Yemen themselves have had to experience having to take up armed struggle against an oppressive power plays a role in them being more able to empathize with the Palestinians?
For sure. So one thing it's very important to point out that during the 9-year war on Yemen, uh, or 7 years, the Ansarullah government has always kind of framed the war as a U.S. led war, not a Saudi intervention. They always recognize as these Arab countries are under U.S. Rule essentially, right? They are puppet regimes, and U.S. makes all the calls. So it's essentially a U.S. war on Yemen and by extension the region, right? So they kind of built into the ideology of the Yemenis that hey, this fight is not just us kicking out the Saudi-led intervention. It's actually us taking down or taking on the U.S. hegemony within the region. So that already is kind of planting a seed of anti-colonial, anti-imperial thinking within the population.
The fact that they are not recognized as a state actor, do you think that plays a role that sort of gives them more leeway to be free from the restraints diplomatically that recognized states are usually subject to? Do you think that plays a role?
For sure, they're not because the UN was quick to condemn all the acts they were doing and such, and
They're actually on the UN terror list.
yeah, exactly. So they it definitely like they don't have as much restrictions as you said, but I don't know if that will change even if they were to be recognized as the and there were also reports saying that the US was willing to recognize them as the official government and remove them from the terror list if they had to stop their operations in the Red Sea, which they refused. So, but these are again all reports. We cannot tell if these are true or not.
Well, if it's true, then that's just one more confirmation that it's effective, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
What is your opinion of the role Iran plays, both in Yemen and in the Middle East in general at this moment?
So Iran is kind of the main backer of the what is called the axis of resistance, right? We know it exists in Lebanon, in Palestine, in Syria, in Yemen, in Bahrain, a very small group, and in Iraq as well. Uh, Iran obviously has their own interests, right? Whether it be their nuclear weaponry that a lot of people talk about, and the West tries to scare people about that as if the West doesn't hold like 5 nukes themselves, and which is pretty ridiculous. Uh, Iran's role in the region, we recognize, is that it doesn't come out of the kindness of their hearts, right? It comes out of interests. That is, we know that everyone is aware of that. The only thing is, regardless of that fact, their interests align with the region's anti-colonial thinkers, anti-colonial parties. And so, whether or not we like or we prefer having Iran as our backers or whatever. I don't think that matters. I think what matters is backing the resistance against the Zionist entity, for example. And so, if our backer is Iran, regardless of their interests, as long as it aligns with our anti-colonial goals, that's good enough for us, and for me particularly.
Right, and do you also view this in a sense of, in a Marxist sense, you could say the current prime contradiction is between the imperialist influence in the Middle East and the liberation of the Middle East? And in this contradiction, Iran is on the right side. So in the present, we are aligned with Iran, and after that is sort of resolved, then okay, we'll get a new situation with a new primary contradiction, and we'll see then like how to deal with Iran in the future.
Perhaps it's kind of like a cross. We'll cross that bridge when we get there, kind of situation. But we do have a sense, as we discussed earlier, like Iran's presence in Yemen, for example, does not reflect the same kind of presence of the U.S. in Yemen, where all of the resources were going to the U.S. via Saudi companies or such, right? So we'll have to, like I said, we'll have to kind of see it all. Of course, if it ends up happening, but yes, particularly that in that context.
And then how do you view the role of Saudi Arabia, once again, both in Yemen and in the Middle East in general?
So Saudi Arabia and Yemen now they've kind of trying to pull out slowly, right? They suffered some losses in 2022, and they recognize, okay, it's not worth it to continue this ongoing war in Yemen. And obviously, you start to see Saudi slowly align with China, slowly align with Russia. Of course, not fully, but slowly building relations. Now, it doesn't make sense to do America's bidding completely, right? But Saudis always acted with America's interests in mind, because that is where all their funding comes from, right? Whether it be weaponry or security in general. And there was this idea of a Middle Eastern NATO, right? Which the US was planning right before uh, Al-Aqsa flood operation took place. And so Saudi is there to be basically enact American interests in the region, and that's always been their foundation.
And what direction do you think they will be moving in the future?
They will probably start building warm relations with China and other nations, but I don't think they will fully back out from the US support, because they rely heavily on that. And the US is way more fond of monarchies in ruling than perhaps like country like China and such. Although China doesn't really get involved really in the politics of other countries the same way the US would, for example. And I don't see them fully committing to the BRICS and China bloc, unless they really start to see the U.S. empire kind of dissolving slowly. The current administration did not like leave a good impression for the Saudis. Biden, particularly, even when it comes to Yemen, Biden wasn't as supportive of their war as Trump was. And we'll have to see what now happens with Trump getting back in power. Perhaps they might even restart the war in Yemen or such. We'll have to see. Um, but yeah, slowly there are some cracks showing within the relationship, but I do not see it completely going away, because if it does, then you can expect a sudden coup happening in Saudi.
Yeah, because do you think without foreign backing, the Saudi monarchy is able to hold on to power for a long period of time?
Definitely not. Definitely not. They desperately need the foreign backing, particularly U.S. backing. There is a lecture by Roy Casagrande. I'm sure you might know him. He made the point that the foundation of the Saudi monarchy was the deal that the U.S. gets infinite oil, and Saudi gets infinite security and backing, whether it be internal or foreign threats. So that is their entire state is alive just from that foundation.
And as far as you can tell, is there a lot of discontent within Saudi Arabia?
I don't know for sure. They wouldn't really be able to express it. There are a few online figures who have fled from Saudi who talk about this in extensive manner. But again, the Saudi population it's not suffering economically as the other nations within the region, so it wouldn't reflect as much. As long out of mind, out of sight kind of situation. And if I have a shelter, and unfed, and some of them have more than just shelter and food, right? And there isn't much discontent. We also have to take into account that the current crown prince MBS is much more liberal in the sense that he started opening up Saudi to foreign investments and events, and now you see like the World Cup. They're planning the World Cup in a decade or so, and he's opening it up more to just because previously Saudi was this kind of closed off theocracy, right? And now it's starting to be basically a hub, and a lot of businesses are moving there. You see them with sports and such, and there is definitely discontent, but you wouldn't really feel it. Some people are happy with the liberal direction that it's taking. In fact, there might be even more acceptance of the government from the population, seeing that they have opened up, but you wouldn't hear much of the discontent really.
Yeah, and do you think this opening up is a strategy of sort of hedging in the context of the anticipated energy transition?
For sure, yeah, because they cannot keep relying on just their oil produce for the next 50 years, right? They have to invest into something else. There's also the futuristic city of Neom they're building, right? And they're move into again like celebrities, sports, all this kind of things that they're opening up to. It's for sure they cannot sustain that within the coming decades. So they're looking to doing other things, and they saw what the UAE did. The UAE became like a tech hub, business hubs. All the businesses are there, and they're kind of following in that group. And obviously, it's a bit harder within Saudi. It's a bigger country. There's a lot more varying populations, religious diversity in Saudi compared to the UAE. So they're trying to definitely go into that direction for sure.
What do you think their role, the role they currently play in regard to Palestine?
You're talking about Saudi in this case,
Yes.
in regards to Palestine. Yeah, so if you there was an interview with the Crown Prince a month before the operation on the 7th of October, and he was discussing normalizing with Israel and such. Obviously, it's not as easy for him to normalize because the population is still pro-Palestinian, even if it doesn't show, right? And so Saudi has been like trying to push a two-state solution desperately so that they can normalize and they can build this Middle Eastern NATO and basically kind of fend off Iran, right? Because their whole thing is like, oh, we want to create this to fend off Iran from further influence within the region. And the possibility of a two-state solution, which even groups like Hamas is now not completely opposed to it, will welcome the idea. If Hamas no longer acts or like drops armed resistance, for example, Saudi will be very happy with that, right? So they have been trying to endorse a two-state solution. Of course, all diplomatically, no actual action besides just diplomatic support. And so the whole now it's everything is halted because of what's happening in Palestine, right? And so they are urgently hoping for a ceasefire to be implemented and a two-state solution to be implemented so that they can continue with their normalization and their building of Middle Eastern NATO.
Yeah, so they view the Palestinians more as an obstacle to their goals than as a cause to be concerned about.
Correct. At least that the government, of course, we're not talking about the people, right?
Yeah,
That's
naturally,
definitely
yeah.
that's definitely the case.
And what about Jordan? How do you assess their role?
So Jordan, there's a book called A Brutal Friendship: The West and the Arab Elites. It was written by a Palestinian writer, and he made a sentence where he wrote a sentence where in the book it says Israel and the U.S. and the UK are more concerned about the leaders of Jordan than they are about the leaders of Israel. Right? They protect Jordan for more than they would protect their own leaders because Jordan serves as this kind of uh, protection for the Zionist entity, the government, that is, because the people are riled up. And like you mentioned earlier, a lot of them are Palestinians themselves, and they are riled up. You hear a lot about cross-border shootings, and there was a few days ago an attempt at the Israeli embassy in Jordan. And so the whole point of it is to prevent any flows of arms into the Palestinian resistance groups and to just protect Israeli interest. You can see in Syria, like Syria is like the main supply weapon from Iran to the Lebanese resistance, the Palestinian resistance, right? And Jordan would essentially be turned into that, if not more, if this regime falls. But the regime is here to stay because it's heavily, heavily protected. And unlike even other monarchies like Iraq, Yemen, they did not fall despite many attempts of revolution because they're heavily protected by these foreign countries because of the role they serve to protect the Zionist entity and to prevent any weapon flow to the resistance in Palestine.
So, do you think there's any prospect of the government in Jordan being overthrown by its people? And if that would happen, does that depend first on the West becoming too weak geopolitically to be able to sustain them, or can this happen in the relatively near future?
Oof, it's a tough one. It can happen in the near future. I mean, there's a massive hunger strike that the Jordanian population is taking. A lot of them also Palestinians, as we mentioned, because the population is very very like riled up, and there is a possibility of some kind of revolution. But the problem is because it is so important, the West is preventing any kind of weapon flow to Jordan, whereas countries like Syria saw a lot of weapon flows from before, Iraq, and all the countries. But Jordan is very very heavily guarded around it. It is definitely the next country to keep an eye on in the region. You understand? Like they are the next potential revolution, I would say.
Yeah, there's some people who argue that as soon as Palestine is liberated, then this will not necessarily result in a one Palestinian state, but in the long run in one Arab state. So this will dissolve the arbitrary divisions between the different Arab states. Do you give this theory any credence?
I do think it is a step towards that, although I do not think it will immediately happen. But I think more importantly, after hopefully the liberation of Palestine, there has to be a socialist framework implemented in the region, because the region will not sustain itself if it continues on this capitalist consumerist kind of approach that it has at the moment, because you start to see infighting. For example, there's exploitation of other Arab countries by Arab countries themselves. You see what's happening in Sudan, and it's exploitation of UAE there. And there has to be a socialist framework for the entire region for that one state to happen. And that is kind of what Nasser was working towards, or what's trying to preach, right? It was just this one Arab state, socialist states, the wealth that the oil wealth being used to build infrastructure across the entire region in poorly developed countries, and backing any resistance movements if need be. At that point, for example, it was Algeria and such. So the freeing Palestine is one thing, although a lot of people would argue is that we need to implement that framework first, gather our nationalize our resources as one region, and then free Palestine. That was kind of what Nasser was thinking. But there's also now thinkers who are indeed saying once Palestine is free, there will be a step towards that framework.
Like you said, Jordan is the next country to watch. Could it potentially be the case that as soon as hypothetically the Zionist entity is defeated and dissolved, then Jordan loses its utility as a support front for Zionism in the West, which will trigger the overthrow of the monarchy there? And I mean, logically, the first two countries to dissolve into one might well be Palestine and Jordan, right?
Correct, because if you go back to the older maps and older books, like Jordan was always kind of like rural Palestine, right? It was just always considered rural Palestine, and it has a lot more desert kind of nomadic kind of tribes and such, but it was always kind of considered rural Palestine. Of course, the first kind of unity you would see is indeed kind of Palestine, Jordan, and then it will follow by Lebanon and Syria. They were always one, right? The Levant. They were always one country. Even like if you go way back, Palestine was kind of considered southern Syria or southern Levant way back. It's because they were just one nation, and it does make sense that if indeed Palestine were to be liberated, that would be the next kind of unification. The unification process itself might take time, but if the West, for example, rejects this unification for whatever reason, which they will find the reason, they will have reasons because they will continue to try and exploit these countries. They will still back the Jordanian monarchy, although maybe not as much. So it might not be worth it to sustain that regime.
Last week, someone, a Palestinian from Jordan, told me that the state of Jordan, its borders, are actually specifically drawn with the intent of making the state not economically viable. So there's no agricultural land, there's not really any petrochemical resources, and there's also nothing else in terms of industrialization or mining. So
Yeah.
I never thought about that, but do you agree with this? And might this also be a trigger for the people of Jordan to seek closer integration with neighboring countries because of the way their economy is structured right now?
For sure, and they have a lot of reliance. For example, they rely on the Zionist entity to provide them with water. For example, the whole point prior to the UN partition plan, for example, and on such was that the British wanted to give Jordan to the Arabs, right, and all of Palestine to the Zionists, right, and that was the whole plan, which is also why Arabs heavily rejected it, not just because it was their land, number one, but also because the land that they were given was not viable. It did not make sense. It was always considered rural Palestine. The mainland Palestine was the much more developed and much more industrial compared to Jordan at that point, Transjordan. So they definitely would need to unify to kind of keep it going if especially Western funding kind of pulls out of the country.
So, about the situation in Syria, what do you think about the way it's being framed in Western media right now?
Yeah, it's absolutely ridiculous. First of all, the fact that you would call them rebels is a pretty insane thing. That's number one. And rebels imply you're rebelling against some kind of corruption, which whatever you want to say about the Syrian regime, it doesn't matter because these groups are not rebelling for the Syrian people. They have their own interests and they are aligned with literal terrorist groups that the West has so-called fought all these years, right? At the same time, backed obviously, and just the way it's being framed in not just Western media but even Arab media, it's ridiculous. And I mean, that's just kind of been the Western playbook in the region, right? It's never been about actually the rights of the people, the lives of the people. It's always been what's it's the geopolitics playground. How can we extract the most resources? How can we weaken our enemies, right? And how can we build these uh, allies that really undermine the actual Arab population and the entire population in the Middle East. And it's always been the playbook. It doesn't surprise me one bit. Like these are the same politicians who will call out the Muslims here, for example, in European countries for their quote unquote backwardness and their conservatism, but they would back the worst, uh, you know, Salafi jihadists, as you mentioned, in these countries. It's just the hypocrisy, but it's also been the Western playbook for over 100 years now. It's nothing new, but it is like hypocrisy, and it's ridiculous.
It seems to me that every single Islamic based government in the Middle East has come about as a direct or indirect result of Western interference. Because at first, secular socialist Arab nationalism was, of course, the main political current,
Yeah,
and the West backed the Salafists as a way of counteracting this socialist influence, right?
100%. In the 50s, when it was the peak of Arab nationalism under Nasser's rule, right, and there was a lot of Arab nationalism being spread and such, the West backed the Muslim Brotherhood to combat the idea of Arab nationalism. There was multiple assassination attempts on Nasser and such and other Arab nationalist thinkers. Of course, you might have heard of the Eisenhower Doctrine, which a lot of people like to believe that it was the doctrine to fight communism within the region of the Middle East. But he even admitted himself, Eisenhower, he admitted that the actual main goal was to prevent any sign of Arab unification happening, and then fighting communism within the region. That was the main goal. It was to prevent that because if that were to be done, all the resources in the Middle East stays in the Middle East, and that is about 60% of oil in the world, and that will not bode well for the West.
Yeah, I think that's a good note to end on. Let's hope that the future will have something like this in store, where this dream which Nasser started to build might come about one day, perhaps in our lifetimes.
Hopefully, it's like a hard reach, but it's always about the work you put in for the future generations, right? To implement these thoughts and dreams that we have.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Yes, no problem.